Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. With us are Peter Baker and Susan Glasser. Peter Baker is chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. Susan Glasser, his wife, is a staff writer for the New Yorker. Together, they've written a dynamite new book entitled The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. James A. Baker had an extraordinary career. He served 5 presidents. He ran 6 presidential campaigns. He held a number of diverse portfolios in the government. He was White House Chief of Staff, Secretary of the Treasury, and Secretary of State. His signal accomplishment as Secretary of State was negotiating the end of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. We're delighted to welcome Peter Baker and Susan Glasser to the program. So, congratulations on your book, #1 bestseller in practical politics on Amazon this morning. It's flying off the shelves. You must be very pleased.
Thank you, Jim. We're so glad to be with you today. Thank you for your interest.
Yes.
Thanks for having us.
Now you, it's almost like Joseph harvesting for 7 years. You in the desert. You worked on this book for 7 years, and was this your first one-person biography?
Yeah, I think it's we call it the first book we've done that was a full-on biography of one person from start to finish. Yeah, a lot of fun that way because you got a whole life to tell the story.
Now, it wasn't your first collaboration, was it?
No, that's right. We wrote Kremlin Rising together, which came out in 2005. We were based in Russia together in the former Soviet Union for the Washington Post for 4 years. And so that book was sort of a culmination of that tour as foreign correspondents.
Everyone will want to know, what is it like trying to write a book with one spouse? This is very unusual, I think. And how do you divide the labor, and who is the chef and who is the sous chef? Who's the writer and who's the editor?
Well, we met in a newsroom. So we met at the Washington Post. We were both working there, and Susan was my editor and I was a reporter. So we established the pecking order from the very start. But actually our personal relationship and our professional relationship have been intertwined from the very beginning. It's at the heart of who we are. We've experienced, as Susan said, we went overseas together, reported together. We've done now a second book together. And we divide, it's a natural tandem, I think, for us. We divide things up depending on what the project might require. But the most important thing we do is sort of try to frame a book together and figure out what we want to try to do with it. And I think that's one of the reasons we enjoyed this book so much, because it's a story not just about Jim Baker, but about Washington. And we thought we could tell this bigger story through his life.
Well, we did just celebrate our 20th anniversary and we're still on speaking terms. So it went okay. But this is a big challenge playing out over such a long period of time. And, it really was something too, because Peter was able to have a couple book leaves, which I wasn't. So it was a very different experience than working on Kremlin Rising.
Now, you both had day jobs. Did you just write at night? I mean, you said Peter had a book leave, but how did you manage to get the time to do this?
Well, Peter doesn't sleep. That's one of his secrets. I require a little bit more in the way of shut-eye.
This is why I wanted you to come on, Susan, because I want to hear about Peter's sleeping habits.
Look, this was a joy to do a book like this. And so in some ways it was our hobby. Like, there was time you might have spent doing other things. We were happy to devote to this. So it did take longer because, as you point out, we have day jobs and they've been kind of busy the last few years. So it might've been done sooner had it not been for that. But I think we enjoyed every minute. It was kind of like a time travel back to a different era.
We did a tremendous amount of research. Of course, James A. Baker is not related to you, Peter, but you interviewed him, certainly. How many times did you interview him? And who did the interviewing, you or Susan?
Yes.
We both spoke with him, sometimes together and sometimes separately. So that was one of the great things, is that it was a running conversation over a long period of time with the subject of the biography, which is somewhat unusual. And I think really was to our benefit. We felt that we did get a chance to really not only talk to Secretary Baker a lot, but to see him in his native habitats, if you will. And we visited him at his ranch in Wyoming with his wife, Susan, which is really, I think, the place closest to his heart. He is a Texan, born and bred, but in many ways, he's really a Westerner as much as a Southerner. And he's loved Wyoming since a trip there with his father, a month-long hunting and fishing trip when he was just 14 years old. And so that was really, I think, important. We also went all around Houston with Secretary Baker to see, the places he grew up, where he went to school, even the cemetery where he plans to be buried alongside the rest of his family. And then, we spent time with him here in Washington as well. He has a favorite suite at the Willard Hotel, just a couple blocks from the White House, that he still likes to stay at. So it was really a very enriching part of doing this biography, was to be able to engage with its subject.
Now, he served a number of presidents, I think we said 4. Did you interview those who were still alive? I guess Ford wasn't alive at the time that you began your research. Did you interview the 2 Bushes or Reagan?
We interviewed both Bushes and Jimmy Carter, because Carter had actually, of course, gone up against Baker when he ran Jerry Ford's campaign in 1976, and later actually served as co-chair with Baker of an election commission after the Florida recount to try to figure out ways to improve the system. So Carter had some things to say about Baker. Actually had a lot of respect for Baker. Baker and Carter, ironically, worked pretty well together when Baker was Secretary of State, and they kind of collaborated to end the Contra War that has so debilitated the Reagan administration. So yeah, we got a chance to talk to 3 presidents, a number of other secretaries of state, secretaries of defense, and vice presidents, Dick Cheney, Dan Quayle. But just as important, we also got to talk with, as Susan said, his wife, Susan, and all 8 of his children, and his cousin, who was like a brother to him, and even his 106-year-old nanny. So we were blessed to have a lot of really good opportunities to talk to people who were part of his life.
Now, he really had a Brady Bunch kind of family. His first wife tragically died early, and then he remarried and I guess had a daughter with Susan. But you got to speak with all the children about what it was like growing up in a kind of blended family.
Well, it was sort of a Brady Bunch from hell, really. I mean, it's interesting. The 2 families had been very close before the parents were married. And actually, Susan Baker was one of Jim Baker's first wives, very close friends, before she tragically died of cancer at a young age. And, there's this incredible story, in fact, that she left behind a note for Jim Baker in the house. Both of them were hiding from each other the fact that they knew she was going to die. And after she did, in fact, pass away, it was her close friend Susan who came over to the house to show Jim Baker where this letter was and to give it to him. It was just absolutely heartbreaking. And she had a troubled marriage of her own. She had an alcoholic husband who later died. And so she got divorced. She had 3 children. He had these 4 boys. They got married. And then the close friendship between all the kids, it just blew up, basically. And they were mad. They were mad at their parents, for sort of changing their lives, trying to replace their mom. And also, Jim and Susan got married without telling the kids first. So it really was a very challenging time, which, again, this is not something that a man of that era, I think, would have been as open at talking about back in the 70s or 80s when he was at the height of his power. But we found him in, when he was in his mid 80s is when we were talking with him for this book, and he was extremely forthcoming and, clear-eyed about it. And, both of them were. It was remarkable, actually.
Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks. The title of your book is The Man Who Ran Washington. He really ran Washington over a period of about a quarter century, serving the 4 presidents. How do you compare the toxic environment we've seen in Washington over the past 4 years, even going back 6 years or more into the Obama administration, and the Washington climate in the era of James A. Baker?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, it's easy to romanticize the past. We shouldn't do that. It was obviously a partisan time back then too, but it wasn't like today. It wasn't like toxic is a good word. I'm glad to use that because it feels poisonous rather than competitive or partisan. Now, Baker was a fierce partisan. He ran 5 presidential campaigns. He was no softy. Ask Michael Dukakis or Al Gore. He would give as good as he got. He was a ruthless, cutthroat operative. The difference was when the election was over, Baker would sit down with the people from the other side of the aisle in order to work out some deals, in order to get some stuff done. That the purpose of a campaign, as ugly as it could be, was to get to the point where you could govern and you could do things. So he sat down with Democrats and worked out a deal on Social Security. He sat down with Democrats and worked out a deal on the tax code. He sat down with Democrats, as we just said, and worked out a deal to end the Contra war. And that's what's so different right now. The incentive structure has changed in Washington so that the word compromise is no longer seen as a virtue, but a vice. It's a dirty word. And the Jim Baker style of governance and making things run is basically on the outs modern Washington.
Didn't you say that it was kind of his philosophy when he went into a negotiation to always leave something on the table for the other side?
Look, I think it's true of most good negotiators, and that Baker really was a natural at deal making, and that's in a way the essence of the person, right? If you ask him, he'll say, "Well, I succeeded because I was, disciplined, or I was focusing on hard work." He has this slogan, the 5 Ps, he calls it, and his children will roll their eyes. They've heard it so often, but prior preparation prevents poor performance. But look, we all know that there are plenty of fanatically disciplined workaholic lawyers in Washington, and not all of them, in fact, no one has had the combined portfolio and different successes in different roles that Baker did. And I think Peter and I came away feeling like it was at heart his deal making abilities and his intuitive understanding, both that the other partner in the negotiation needs to have an outcome that works for him or her, but also someone said he understood the ricochets of politics, how the balls, would hit each other and collide and interact. And that is something that really, information can inform that and preparation, but it's also instinctual. And even, by the way, well into his senior years, that's what he takes the most pride in, is deal making. It was just a few years ago, the Texas Episcopal Church was at an impasse over same-sex marriage, and many of the Southern Episcopal churches were withdrawing from the national church over this. Jim Baker negotiated a deal, and the Texas Episcopal Church was the only one that didn't withdraw from the national church. That's what he takes pride in. That's his essence.
He has been compared, and maybe you do it in the book, with Henry Kissinger as the two most influential secretaries of state of the second half of the 20th century. Did you interview Henry Kissinger?
We did, actually, yes. And I could make the case that Baker in some ways is even more significant than Kissinger, because in fact, Baker presided as Secretary of State at a time when the world really changed. I mean, it changed on his watch, and he helped to manage that in terms of the end of the Cold War, the reunification of Germany, the Gulf War that changed the sort of the nature of the world order. All these things happened on Baker's watch. In some ways, I think you could argue even eclipsed Kissinger's time, but Kissinger's probably more celebrated, more of a geopolitical strategist. He's sort of seen as an intellectual architect of foreign policy. Baker is a transactional guy. He's a negotiator, a deal maker, as we said. He wouldn't talk to you about the Treaty of Westphalia or the theory of the nation state. His idea is to go into a room and get something done. So we do compare the two in that sense. And Kissinger and Baker like each other, although there's a certain competitiveness there too, I think, because they both were so successful and celebrated in their own different ways. And today they sometimes collaborate on pieces. But Tom Donilon, who was President Barack Obama's national security advisor, told us that he thinks that Baker was the most important unelected official in Washington in the last half century.
Well, it's kind of interesting because Baker never held public elective office. He spoke no foreign languages. He had no training in foreign relations, no formal training in foreign relations or policy. And in that sense, he was very different from Henry Kissinger. Plus, as you've pointed out, he had no grand vision of the world that he was trying to elaborate. And yet he got things done. So does that really sum up the rivalry between them? Kissinger was kind of dismissive of Baker when you interviewed him, wasn't he?
Well, I think Kissinger was dismissive of Baker to a certain extent because he's not self-proclaimed intellectual. When we interviewed him, I asked him about, sort of what he had studied about the Soviet Union, and he laughed and he said, well, he had a tennis coach growing up in Houston who was like a second father to him, who was a part of the white Russian diaspora after the revolution. He's not a book man. And remember, he's also a guy who became Treasury Secretary, and a very successful Treasury Secretary, after a single undergraduate course at Princeton in economics, at which he probably didn't do very well at. At least history was his best
in that
subject.
sense, his career parallels mine, because I took the same course and I didn't do very well.
I also would say that my freshman economics course at Harvard was probably not sufficient qualification to be Treasury Secretary. The truth is that Baker actually is a natural diplomat, and it's interesting. He does have a pretty well-honed view, actually, of American leadership and American power in the world. He is an internationalist. He's a believer in alliances. He's definitely a believer in the U.S. Sitting at the head of the table and shaping a world of free flow of trade and information and ideas. That in part really does flow from him and George H.W. Bush, and how they wanted to see the world after the Cold War. He's very skeptical about the use of military power as part of American leadership. And in fact, as you know, was dubious, to say the least, about George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq in 2003. Remains, in all our conversations with him, I think that's an important part of the principle. He is actually a diplomat at heart and a believer in the power of interactions and globalization, and not barriers and walls.
I'm glad you mentioned George H.W. Bush, because Nixon was also dismissive of Baker, and he said that the only reason he got where he got was because he was a friend of George H.W. Bush. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about their relationship.
Yeah, look, Baker, Baker obviously did get where he got to, partly because of the friendship of Bush, but it doesn't mean that he wouldn't have, he doesn't mean he would necessarily succeed. A lot of Bush's friends obviously didn't become Secretary of State. A lot of Bush's friends didn't become White House Chief of Staff.
Well, Nixon had been wrong before, so I guess he could be wrong about this.
Yeah, but Nixon, you're right. Nixon was very dismissive of both Bush and Baker, saw Baker as kind of a faker, only out for himself, self-interested, wants to run for president. He was he had these very caustic things to say to Monica Crowley, who was his foreign policy aide and later wrote about it in a book. But part of that was because, Bush was operating on Nixon's turf, which is to say foreign affairs. Nixon fancied himself as the maestro of foreign affairs, and nobody else could do it as well as he did. So he second guessed anybody who came after him. But in the end, Baker, accomplished things that Nixon didn't.
Well, Bush and Baker were competitive with each other. They played tennis against each other rather ferociously, as you recount in the book. It's certainly true. There were, I believe, 6 secretaries of state who eventually became president. Didn't Baker have some aspirations and ambitions to become the president?
Well, you're right. I mean, this was an extraordinary friendship and relationship that played out over several decades, of private and public life between Bush and Baker. They met on the tennis courts of the Houston Country Club. They were both fanatically competitive. They did team up as a doubles team and are very proud of the championships that they won together. That bond, though, it wasn't just a mere social bond. And I think that's important to note. In many ways, actually, they ultimately became as close as any president and secretary either ever, or certainly since Jefferson and Madison. And, one thing we found in the course of the book really reinforced that for us, which was, I mentioned before, the tragic early death of Mary Stuart, Baker's first wife. We found a letter that Baker wrote to George Bush, in which he confessed to George that Mary Stuart had been given this tragic cancer diagnosis, and that he had told no one, not his mother, not his children, and not even his wife. But he was telling George, and that, of course, is an extraordinary bond that goes far beyond, kind of cocktails at the country club. And so, flash forward into their public life together. There was a sibling aspect to it, and like many people go into a family business together, there was plenty of friction when they were in the heat of things. There were times when Barbara Bush, in particular, was very unhappy with Baker, especially after Bush lost in '92. But who was there at Bush's bedside when he died? It was Jim Baker. Was there 3 times on the last day of Bush's life, and literally rubbing his feet as he passed away.
One of the interesting riddles about Baker is his attitude toward Israel and the Jews. He did organize the Madrid conference, engaged in shuttle diplomacy, I think made, 8 trips to the region in 8 months to get it together. And maybe that kicked the ball off for a peace process, and maybe it didn't. But at one point, perhaps in exasperation, he was quoted as saying, F the Jews, they don't vote for us anyway, so we really should, implication being we should lean on them to make peace with the Palestinians. What was your takeaway from that?
Yeah, we think that episode, it's an important episode because it remains to this day a big sore point among Israelis, among a lot of American Jews. A lot of people look at Baker and think and feel very passionately and bitterly about him, even to this moment, largely because of that episode you talk about, and because of the pressure that he was willing to put on Israel on issues like settlements and pulling back loan guarantees. Now, that actual moment that has been described, the F the Jews, has probably been somewhat distorted. The original quote was given by Jack Kemp, who was a cabinet secretary and kind of a rival of Baker's, to Ed Koch, who was the former mayor of New York, who then wrote about it in a column. And even in the column, Koch didn't actually quote it that way. He quoted F them, not F the Jews. Now, there's a slight difference there, obviously. It's kind of important. In the newspaper column that Koch wrote, somebody, probably an editor, put in brackets the Jews in order to explain who they believed Baker meant. He probably, but that he didn't actually use the words, even under the original allegation, that had been attributed to him all these years. Now, what he wasn't talking about Jews as a general matter. He was talking about the specific organization known as AIPAC, which is a pro-Israeli lobbying organization in Washington, and he was mad at them over some policy issue. And he was saying, "F them, they don't," or he said, "Screw them," is what he said. They don't vote for us. So it's a difference. It's a subtle difference, but it's an important difference. And it's a festering sore even to this day, I think, for a lot of supporters of Israel and who don't like Secretary Baker.
Following the Madrid conference, was it just symbolic, or did something concrete come out of it? Perhaps not under George H.W. Bush's administration, but later. I mean, did the Madrid conference lead to the Oslo Accords, which then led to where we are today?
Well, you could make that argument, definitely. I think this was probably one of the great disappointments for Jim Baker in terms of his career on the world stage, was not being able to follow up on the Madrid conference because of George H.W. Bush's defeat in the 1992 presidential election. And I think they both saw Mideast peace, a sustainable Mideast peace, as the legacy that they were shooting for in a second Bush term. And obviously they didn't get it. Now, Clinton, interestingly, came in, obviously not focused on foreign policy. And then there was Yugoslavia to deal with. And, the domestic economy was what really propelled him into office. He did turn back to Mideast peace at the very end of his tenure, arguably when it was too late to get the deal that he or Bush and Baker might have achieved earlier in the 1990s. So, we can look back on it as a tragic missed opportunity. And especially, after the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin, during Clinton's presidency, it didn't happen.
Probably every loyal American ascribes to the slogan "America First," but what Trump seems to think the policy is America alone. Would Jim Baker have bought into America alone? He was an internationalist, wasn't he?
Absolutely. No, he's very troubled by Trump's disdain for the alliances that Baker and a whole generation of American leaders built. He thinks NATO is still one of the best things ever created on the international stage. He thinks that things like NAFTA, the original deal that Baker had a part in by creating a free trade agreement with Canada, is a great deal. He told us it's still a hell of a deal. He believes in international organizations. He was one of the ones who pushed to go to the UN. He pushed George W. Bush to go to the UN before the Iraq invasion. Baker is a believer in internationalism, and I think that's one of the most fundamental differences between him and today's White House.
I have a question for you. The question is, what do you think will be the legacy of James A. Baker III?
He would like statesmen to be chiseled on his gravestone. I think what we found is that he was a master of politics, however you define it, whether it's international politics or American politics, that he was, from the end of Watergate to the end of the Cold War, really Washington's indispensable man.
Washington's indispensable man. So, Peter Baker, Susan Glasser, thank you so much for coming by. Thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care, be safe, and all the best.